Welcome to the History Nerds United podcast. I'm your head nerd, Brendan. Thank you so much for being here. Today, author Cassandra Good and her book, First Family. This is a fantastic book. It was a fantastic conversation. Cassandra's a lot of fun. This subject is a lot of fun. It's about the kids that George and Martha Washington raised. And it gets a little bit historical Kardashian. You'll hear it. It's fun. But before we do that, take a listen to this.
Africa is a land with endless stories to tell. From epic battles, brilliant rulers, and the dramatic rise and fall of civilizations. Join us on the History of Africa podcast to learn the too often unknown stories of the African continent. From the sands of Cairo to the plains of Zimbabwe, and from the mountains of Ethiopia to the forests of the Congo. Find the History of Africa podcast wherever you listen to your podcasts.
All right, take a listen to History of Africa. Andy does a fantastic job. Happy to have his quick ad on here. But now, let's get to Cassandra. And here we are with author Cassandra Good, First Family, George Washington's Heirs, and the Making of America. Cassandra, thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
I'm really excited to get into this book. I mean, especially Mount Vernon is one of my favorite places on Earth. It's very complicated, one of my favorite places on Earth, but real quick, what's your actual day job when you're not writing books that I was salivating over?
I am a history professor at Marymount University in Arlington, Virginia. So during the academic year, that is my day job. Although, beyond teaching, doing research and writing is part of that day job too.
You're reading a lot all of the time, right? Between school and books, it's just constant reading.
Yes, I read many, many books, although read is sometimes loosely. Sometimes it's more skim.
Well, what I find, and I'm just thinking about this now, even though I talked to a lot of professors before, it's got to be hard then. You've got these poor students who are just trying their best, and yet you're reading some amazing literature to kind of fill your books up with. That's a stark contrast, right? Where it's like, some freshman handed you this, like, this is terrible. I'm going back to Kant or something. There's got to be a huge difference, and it's tough to do in your brain, right?
Well, it's interesting because a lot of academic writing is not very accessible or easy to read. So, well, it's not that it's bad writing, it's also not enjoyable to read. And I've sort of moved away from traditional writing assignments for most of my teaching. So often students are doing presentations or other creative assignments. So I'm not actually grading like writing by students that would be at all similar to what I am looking at in books. And the other interesting thing is I do a flipped classroom now with my survey course where they watch the lectures online and then they have to post one question from that week's lectures before class. And actually, I learn a lot from their questions because they're often asking things where I'm like, that's an obvious question to ask. Why have I never asked that? And why don't I know the answer to that? So I end up spending time sort of digging into things every week as I teach the survey class. So yeah, I actually end up learning things from my students.
Yeah, you sound like one of the cool teachers is doing new stuff as opposed to all of these papers. Not putting down the old style of doing it, but moving on. First Family, when did you decide that you have to read this? I read your previous book, Founding Friendships, so I knew that you love this kind of time in history and this place and these people. What made you say you had to write First Family?
It actually came out of that first book, Founding Friendships. When I was researching that book, I came across Eliza and Nellie Custis and their male friends. And I hadn't heard of them before. And I was trying to figure out who they were. And I thought, wait, George Washington raised children? I never knew that. And, I'd been to Mount Vernon as a kid, and I'm sure I'd seen it mentioned. And so I went to look for a biography of the family, and there wasn't one. And I thought, well, somebody needs to do a biography of Washington's family and what happens to them. And originally was not just going to be the Custis step-grandchildren. I had also come across his nephew, Bushrod, in that first book, who has several female friends. And I thought I'd be writing about him and some of the nieces and nephews as well. And I discovered that I'd basically read all the interesting letters Bushrod had written. There was nothing else there that was interesting in his letters. I think his personal correspondence, he and or his wife probably burned it at some point because there's just not a lot of personal correspondence left with him. And that was pretty common to do. And then the other nieces and nephews were also just kind of like Virginia planters who weren't really talking about their relationship to George Washington and weren't really prominent. So I didn't really have much to say about them. And one of my mentors said, I think you really need to just write about the Custuses. I was like, no, I can't just do them. But I realized she was right, because these are the people that actually saw themselves as Washington's family.
For better or worse, I should say. And we're going to save Bushrod because, of course, if you go to Mount Vernon, you go to Washington's tomb. I think the two things that you'll notice nowadays is, number one, the other monument that kind of sticks out is Bushrod's, right? Like that's the one you see when you're walking up to it. And then, of course, now you notice the unmarked slave graves across from the tomb. It's just interesting how that all worked out, that it would be right across from the tomb. But that's a question too. We talked about it before we started hitting record. When we say the Custis children, it gets a little confusing because of the way the family is set up. So who are we really talking about in this book, right? Because Washington never had children. Martha started with 2 before she married Washington, right? And then how did it kind of go out from there?
Yeah, in fact, Martha gave birth to 4 children, but only 2 survived young childhood. So she had these 2 children when she marries George, Jackie and Patsy. And they're fairly young when she moves to Mount Vernon. So George Washington is their stepfather and their guardian. Patsy dies when she's 17 of what we think is an epileptic fit. And then Jackie gets married very young, and they very quickly have 7 children, 4 of whom survive. It is those 4 children that we're talking about in the book. And in order, they are Eliza, Patty, Nellie, and Wash. And I'm giving them their nicknames here because it's just so much easier than saying their names.
I mean, they all have the same name, basically.
Well, because all of them have Parke Custis as part of their name also. So but Wash is George Washington Parke Custis. And George and Martha unofficially adopted Nellie and Wash Custis. There was no legal adoption at this point, but they take them in and they're raising them because they sort of recognize for a widow in her 20s to have 4 young children is not very practical. So this is a common arrangement. But the older 2 daughters also are at Mount Vernon a lot and are very close to George and Martha as well.
And what's it like being brought up by George and Martha? Because I got this sneaking suspicion that Martha might not win Mother or Grandmother of the Year awards for various reasons. What would it be like being brought up by George and Martha?
Yeah, I think it's surprising, this comment that maybe she wasn't, Mother of the Year or something, because she tends to be portrayed as this very affectionate, maternal, grandmotherly figure. And, I try not to judge her here, but certainly other members of her family judged her as not being a strong enough disciplinarian. Her daughter-in-law was very worried about this. George himself was worried about this. George Washington himself, the tutor for the kids, all felt that she was spoiling the grandkids. Now, there was a sort of trope at the time, as there is now, that grandmothers spoil their grandchildren. So that may be part of it. But even if you look at with her own children, Jackie and Patsy, it doesn't seem like there's a lot of discipline there. Jackie and then his son Wash have similar experiences of going to college, dropping out, going to another college, dropping out, never really making it in a career. And it's clear that there's not a lot of boundaries put on them. And certainly for Wash, there's people around Martha saying he needs some boundaries, he needs some guidance, he needs more discipline. And I think for her, part of it that we have to understand is that she had lost so many people in her life, that she lost 2 of her 4 young children. And then by the time she's raising the grandchildren, she's lost the only 2 surviving children. She's constantly really worried about their health. So part of that lack of discipline may also be related to how fearful she is about anything happening to them. Part of it, again, maybe sort of the perception here. There's also, if you look at kids of this generation born during or soon after the American Revolution, especially the boys, Wash is not that different. A lot of them end up getting in trouble in school, not making a lot of themselves. I mean, if you look at Dolly Madison's son, Payne, he ends up with huge debts from gambling. A lot of these kids, I think part of it too is the expectations for them are very, very high. And the belief was that they needed to learn themselves how to be good citizens. And I don't think that the parents always were as hands-on teaching them how to do that as maybe would have been necessary for it to happen.
And the stark difference with the boys and the girls, too, is the boys seem to not listen for the most part when it comes to, hey, don't get married right now, or don't marry this person. And it seems like there's a generational aspect of them that's like, no, I'm definitely not going to listen. We are not going to, as a family, we are not going to learn this lesson in any way, shape, or form.
So Jackie goes ahead and gets married really young. But when Wash tries to do the same thing, George and Martha and his mom are able to stop him. They may have only been able to stop him because the woman in question here, who we're not even sure exactly who she was, but she says, like, no, I don't think this is a good idea. I think she backed out. And that's part of why that didn't happen. So by the time that Wash gets married, I think the family is happy with the woman he's marrying.
It's amazing to think about when we're going back to Martha and George and the way kind of they parent, right? Is that, okay, yes, Martha may have been too lax and all of that stuff, but at the same time, George just couldn't seem to figure them out or control them either. You talk about somebody who, as Americans, we look at as father of our country, but then you read these letters where he's just a normal dad saying, I don't know what this kid is doing. I don't know what they're thinking. I don't know how to make them understand. Like, it was very relatable seeing George just being completely exasperated with his children, just like anybody else would, right?
Yeah, and he doesn't sort of learn from the experience with Jackie how to do it better with Wash. I'm not sure if he could have, but he has the same experience with both of these boys and getting incredibly frustrated. I mean, he says about Wash, basically, like, this kid has been lazy since he was little. And he recognizes that part of it is Wash knows he's going to inherit a huge fortune. He doesn't need to get an education. He doesn't need to behave in any particular way. He's got it made. And the other thing that, Washington himself doesn't point out, but the tutor Tobias Lear notes, is that Washington also has, Wash also has enslaved people waiting on him from a very young age. There are 2 women who are in charge of taking care of the grandkids, 2 enslaved women. And anytime he wants anything, enslaved people have to bring it to him. He, as a child, gets to be bossing around and behaving however he wants to people who have to serve him. And Lear, being from New Hampshire and not an enslaver himself, sort of looks at this and sees this is not going to be good for his personality.
It feels like MTV in the 1700s in certain ways, just like the stuff going on. But I mean, especially, and this is a question I wanted to ask you. You talk about this right at the beginning of the book, where when we're talking about the institution of slavery and the words that we're using, we're still kind of figuring it out, what that looks like when we're writing. So like for I noticed, you'll talk about people who are enslaved. Another term used is bonds people and things like that. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because like bonds people, that's the first time I've ever seen that in print. Where do these terms come from? Why are we doing these particular changes or anything like that? Or is it still really just everybody trying to figure it out?
I think we are still figuring it out, but historians are trying to move away from using the term slave because it denotes somebody's status, but it doesn't make them human. Whereas saying an enslaved person returns to humanity, but that's also long to say. So in fact, the bonds people, you will occasionally see other historians using this term, and I was publishing a scholarly article related to this several years ago, and the editor suggested that as an alternate term so that I didn't have to keep using enslaved people. And it still has the word people in it, which is important. And so I use that. And I think using enslaved people has become pretty standard. The question of whether to call people who own enslaved people enslavers, there's still some people who would disagree with that term. I end up using enslaver. I think it at least is better than master. But to some people, enslaver suggests that the person actually went out and captured the enslaved people themselves, which they didn't. There's debate over whether we should be using the term plantation. I do use that term, and I say at the beginning, the alternative right now of enslaved labor camp, I have various sort of discomfort, qualms with that. And then another term that's in debate right now, we used to call people who fled slavery runaway slaves. And there's some people who say, well, that makes it sound like they're doing something wrong by running away. Some people use the term self-emancipate. I had a discussion with some of the other scholars reviewing my book. Should I use that term? Should I not? And we decided no. One scholar of slavery working with me was saying emancipation is a legal form, and self-emancipation suggests that they've gotten a legal freedom, which they haven't necessarily. So the terms are still in flux. And even whether, we capitalize Black now, and there's debate over whether you capitalize the W in white, and I don't here, but I was just working with somebody else where their style guide at their publication is that they do. A lot of this is in flux, and it's really about trying to restore humanity to people.
It's very interesting for me, not to get too philosophical on it, but I know when I read Bond's People, for instance, my thinking was in my head, and I know none of these are necessarily right or wrong or anything like that. My thinking was when you say slave, slave to us is a bad word. It makes you feel something. And I understand trying to bring the humanity back to these people, but is it also then letting these people who had slaves off the hook, right? By softening in that word, by softening what they were doing, that they were taking humanity away from people, which again, I'm not necessarily saying that that's how it has to be or that's the right answer. But for me, it's always kind of like, this is something terrible. And when we read it, it should feel terrible. That word should feel terrible in what's happened. But like you said, there's a lot of reasons to change these words, and we're in the middle of not knowing. I mean, especially the Black and white situation. I remember looking that up, and then it depends on what you're reading. Sometimes white is capitalized, sometimes it isn't, and now Black is capitalized, and then you just get into this war of words, sometimes crazy people that's not worth it.
Well, and that's why I was careful at the beginning to have a note on what terms I was using. And I think the other thing is it's not just about the words you're using, but the larger discussion you're having. And I think you can't come away from reading this book and think, oh, slavery was okay. I think it's pretty clear that, I have a line in there at one point where I say there's no such thing as a quote unquote good master, because you get this line about George Washington. And I say, here are examples of him physically harming enslaved people. And this is what the step-grandchildren saw growing up. And that would have been normal to them because they had seen it from him.
And a couple other things about slavery to pull into this is when we talk about the Custis clan, well, there's the white ones that we were just talking about, and you have all of this in the book. If you just start looking at who came from who, there's also a lot of Black and white descendants who, from various people within the Washington family or the Custis family, however you want to say it, had children with their enslaved people.
Yes.
And it was not like a onesie or a twosie situation. It was a lot, right?
Yeah, even if you go all the way back to, so this is John Parke Custis, and I'm forgetting how many numbers, there's a bunch of John Parke Custises, but this is Daniel Parke Custis, Martha's first husband. His grandfather had a son by an enslaved woman that he, recognized as his son. So this is very common in Virginia families. That doesn't mean that it's okay. I talk about it as sexual exploitation. This is another thing where some people use the word rape for this. And, I spend a little bit of time in the book about how I choose my terms here, but Jackie Custis, there's probably a fifth Custis sibling, William Costin. We don't have, it's not ironclad. And in fact, in the family tree that I have in the book, I have a note before the tree that says there's still research ongoing, especially about these Black descendants. And this is subject to change. We don't actually have DNA tests yet for a lot of this. It's sort of putting together pieces. And then Wash Custis is the one where, as far as I can tell, he probably had around a dozen children by different enslaved women. There's one that is the clearest cut case of, we don't have the DNA, but otherwise it's 99%. It would be shocking if this was not actually his child. She said that he told her he was her father, But then there's all these other women and children that he frees throughout his life. And he does not free adult men. And there were rumors soon after he died about how many children he had by enslaved women. We also know there's a Patty Peter, one of her sons, we don't know which, had a child by an enslaved woman. And there are, present day descendants of all of these people. And some of them had in their family stories, yes, we are descended from white Custises. And that's, in some cases, they don't necessarily want to come forward and talk about that because it's painful. They know that this is, an ancestry born out of exploitation.
So it wasn't just Thomas Jefferson, which, I think we all kind of knew that. And I'm going to go on a full-on rant about Wash later. Like, I'm waiting for it. I don't want to do it too soon, but I'm apologizing now for it. It's coming. Probably my favorite parts of the book is it's very funny. You're writing and you're doing this and you're doing this. And then every now and again you get to, oh, Nellie, said, now I have to do all of this stuff. And you just do a quick aside and say, well, Nellie probably didn't actually do that. She had about 5 enslaved people who were probably doing that for her. But still, she said she was exhausted that she was doing all of these things.
Right.
And it's throughout the book because, they all had enslaved people the entire time. And every time they complained, you're like, but you're not even doing anything, man.
Right. They have hundreds of enslaved people. They are some of the largest enslavers in Virginia, if not the largest. And certainly in Northern Virginia, they are the largest enslavers.
They have so many, they don't even see them very often, right? Like some of these, plantations, whatever you want to call them, are miles away, which means especially for the lazier of the Custis clan, like they may not even go out there for, once or twice a year, if that. People may not even see them for an extremely long period of time.
The largest number of enslaved people are on the Tidewater estates on the Pamunkey River, which the Custis family has had, for a really long time at this point. They don't have all of their original plantations, but they have a bunch of them. And here I'd actually be more comfortable with the enslaved labor camp term because there's not a house here and a white family living here. And, there's not other things going on. This is literally just plantations where people are being forced to labor and make money for absentee white owners. And Wash, you're saying maybe every year or two, from what I can tell, maybe once a decade goes down there. And the treatment of these people is so bad that he has white neighbors complaining about how badly these enslaved people are being treated. Other enslavers are saying, you're mistreating your enslaved people. That's how bad it was. So you really just can't excuse it.
And I know, listen, you're a history teacher, you're a historian, so you're going to, really kind of take both sides and make sure. I'm just going to go full on and say, this is kind of like Succession because I feel like they all kind of suck. This is a wonderful book. It was a very interesting read, but it's like Succession where you're sitting there going, oh my God, how much more can these people drive me nuts as somebody just looking at their lives? The one that sent me really over the edge, George Washington dies, and they have to figure out what to do with his stuff, including Mount Vernon and everything else. Can you please just tell the listeners what happens when George Washington dies and it's time to figure out what to do with his stuff?
Well, so there's a couple of parts to this. So the first thing is that George Washington leaves the house, and I'm sure that the kids knew this was going to happen, to his nephew Bushrod, who does not live there. And supposedly when Bushrod shows up, they're like super rude to him and see him as an interloper. And, Nellie and Wash, even though they're adults at this point, still live in the house. And Nellie's married with a kid and still lives in the house. They're building their own house nearby, but they're basically going to be kicked out of their house. So there's that, and they're not very nice about it. And then, and really this happens after Martha dies, because Martha's going to have use rights to all of George's property after George dies. But after Martha dies that's when Bushrod shows up. That's also when, by the terms of her will, they hold an auction to sell the entire contents of the house, and the money is going to go to the education of some of her nephews. But the Custis siblings pretty much come in and buy everything up before the public gets there. And the other thing is, they don't seem to consider clothing in the same light. Clothing is sort of a weird property category. Interestingly, Laura Edwards has a new book, Only the Clothes on Her Back, that talks about this. And so they don't even include that in the auction. And they apparently just go into a room and draw straws of who's going to get what and divvy up all of George and Martha's clothes, which then are basically treated as relics. Some of them get sort of repurposed into like a sewing case out of one of Martha's dresses, or there's various uses for these fabrics. But then even the farm tools are being sold off at auction. Every single thing in the house, down to, I wrote an article at one point about the fact that Patty Custis Peter and her husband end up buying a bedpan that was George Washington's. And it makes sense in that she's having kids at this point. If you were lying in, women basically stayed in bed for a long time after having a child. Having a bedpan is a practical thing, but it does get later labeled with all of their other Washington relics as a Washington relic. So it's an interesting series of events. But basically what happens is the Custuses get most of the stuff. Bushrod moves into an almost empty house. No, I mean, there aren't even farm tools at the point he moves in.
I mean, it's just, the whole thing sounds so ghoulish. And they weren't even, this was our father, air quotes, fathers, and this is his legacy and all that stuff. It's kind of like, hey, let's make sure we keep the good stuff in case we need to use it later. Like, it just feels so gross.
I don't know how much they're thinking of the prestige of using the objects later. I think Wash is more thinking about that because he buys way more than he needs. But a lot of what they're doing with this stuff, like that bedpan example, is they're furnishing their houses with it. They're all young, setting up their own households at this point. And so they're using this stuff to furnish their household, to have plates and knives and all sorts of accessories in their house. It's not that they're just getting it to sort of use to say, look, I have Washington stuff, but that is what they end up doing with it.
Well, God forbid they had set up their own houses before this in the many, many years they've been alive. But I think it's time for me to talk about how much I hate Wash. I'm not saying that we should physically assault people, but I kind of wanted to slap all of them. But Wash, to me, he's the one that really got me because it feels like he never figured anything out himself. And then when he actually had any modicum of success, it was because he was talking about George Washington. He was cloaking himself in George Washington. And that was his whole life, was that because of where I was born, how I was brought up, I have something to say. And that seemed to be his whole life. So I'll ask it a bit nicer, so that way you don't have to use my words. Who did you find the most frustrating to write about from your perspective?
I mean, they're all hard to write about, right? And because every single person I'm writing about in this book owns enslaved people. So, just starting from there, it's challenging. Yeah, they're not really likable people. They're interesting, but they are not likable. And as a historian, I don't have to like them. And in fact, I wanted to know how other historians had handled writing about people that are obviously objectionable. And so I had asked something about this on Twitter at one point, and Annette Gordon-Reed reminded me that she had written a biography of Andrew Johnson, who is a worse person, I would say, in terms of if you're looking for somebody who very publicly has a, very racist policy agenda and causes real harm to many, many people.
That we are still dealing with today, but yes.
Yes, I would say so. Andrew Johnson, I don't think there's too many people that could argue that this guy does good for the country. So I read Annette Gordon-Reed's biography of him, and I tried not to obviously judge them, but to make clear to the reader what the faults here were. Flawed people are also interesting, and there are parts of them that are likable. I don't think that they're 100% unlikable. And the thing is, Wash in his lifetime was very well liked. Well liked, I should say, by white people, at least. He opens up the spring down by the Potomac River on his property and builds a picnic shelter and pavilion for people. And he goes down there and he plays violin for people. He's like in the tourist guides to DC as somebody you should go see and go see his estate. And there were people at the time who also thought he was ridiculous, which I think he was ridiculous. I mean, he had no natural talent at much of anything, but he was convinced that he was a great playwright and a great painter. He may have been a decent orator. It does seem like he was decent at giving speeches. His paintings are probably the worst out of all of those genres.
You handled that very well. I mean, that's the thing is, I'm saying these things right as bluntly as I can, but it's very funny reading and seeing, and just the way you talk about his painting, I'm sitting there going, this must really be terrible. Like, this painting must really be terrible. And your words are so carefully chosen. It's beautiful. But I'm sitting there going, oh, no, this is terrible painting. Like, this is just absolutely awful.
Well, and the color inset in the full book has one of the paintings. And I mean, in fact, I was just at Arlington House, Wash's house, with the curator yesterday, and we came across a painting that's attributed to Wash, and we both looked at it and we're like, that is too good. It couldn't really be by him, could it? And so he started looking into it, and we're starting to think, why is this actually attributed to Wash Custis? It is not his style. He really can't paint people. When one of his paintings is hanging in the Capitol building, somebody writes in the paper about how bad it is. And he sends somebody to go get it and bring it home and says, drop it in the Potomac on your way home. But he continues to paint and expect people to admire his painting.
When I was reading the book, because Bushrod shows up every now and again, right? But he's not part of this core group. But I couldn't help but kind of compare them. Bushrod, we're not writing a book about Bushrod, right? That's not happening right now. But when you look at his actual accomplishments, he made something of himself. And it seems like he very much made something of himself, not because of George Washington, but kind of side by side. He even reaches out to Washington for help, and Washington tells him no, whereas the Custis children got clearly way too much help. But it just kind of made me think, were the Custis children, by being in that house, being in his shadow constantly, did that make them lazier, right? Why did Bushrod, who, kind of same family, but not as intimate to actually Mount Vernon? Is it just nature versus nurture? All of that stuff that you can't really answer, but he's kind of that perfect example of he was part of the family, but he wasn't. And he did do things. He did things that he had to have talent for. Were you thinking about that when you were writing it? You're just we're just going to focus on these people.
As I mentioned before, Bushrod, in terms of the surviving correspondence, is just kind of boring. He's more interesting when he's younger, but there's not much personal correspondence from later. And he's successful in the sense that he actually has a career in public service, which George Washington wanted Wash to do that. But, Bushrod also apologizes to George Washington when he takes the seat on the Supreme Court, because he knows that's the least prestigious government appointment that he could take. The Supreme Court at this point is not very powerful. It becomes much more powerful a few years later with Justice Marshall, but Bushrod also rarely writes decisions on his own. He's just signing off on Marshall's decisions. It's not like we can look at a great body of jurisprudence that Bushrod Washington crafted. So yes, he's more successful in that sense, but I wouldn't say he's, there's not greatness there. But it is interesting to think that, he's not raised in the household. He is still raised in a wealthy slaveholding household where he has a lot of privileges, but he also doesn't have the fame that the Custis kids have as the first family. I think we can't underestimate how famous those kids were during the presidency and how that goes with them. And Bushrod does not have that. The other thing to consider is, Wash aside, the Custis women could not have had careers. And I do wonder whether if they could have actually, since they were smarter than Wash.
Which granted isn't saying much, but yes.
Well, but Nellie was quite well educated. She had the best education she could have gotten at the time. She was a talented musician and, a voracious reader, very thoughtful person. And, Eliza also was quite intelligent. If they could have actually had careers, especially as public servants, what might they have been able to do? Might they have been less miserable people? I don't know. I think Eliza, certainly, there's people at the time who were saying, her aunt says, her frustration is that she can't wear pants, but basically that she cannot take on male roles, not in a sort of transgender sense, but just a gender restriction as a woman. So I do wonder how things would have turned out differently if these women had more opportunities.
My thinking about that, though, just kind of a slight argument with that, too, is we have the example at the same time, though, of Abigail Adams, who, if you know anything about her, she had to deal with the same types of things, but right. She is, anybody who knows revolutionary history knows she's one of the smartest people, period.
Absolutely. People
that we look at were this guy was amazing. He was the best. They would go to Abigail for can you help me with this? Or what do you think about this? She was, for all intents and purposes, the founding fathers saw her as an equal, at least intelligence-wise.
Yeah.
When I looked at the Custis children, they had that opportunity, right? Because they already had the name to put them into that kind of stratosphere if they wanted to use it. But it seems like while the women did a lot better job of reaching some semblance of potential that they could, and Wash, I'm done talking about him, it did seem like there was still a lot left on the table as far as what they could have done with what they had.
Yeah, and Eliza, if Eliza had not split from her husband and caused this huge controversy erupted, I think it would have been different, because in the short years that she and her husband were married, they were sort of at the center of the Washington political and social scene. And she, talks about how she's got congressmen stopping by all the time, and she's keeping up with what's going on politically. And, even after she gets divorced, she is very close with James and Dolly Madison, but I think that there's still some social stigma attached to her because of that divorce. And then because she ends up flirting with the French ambassador and getting engaged to a French con man. I mean, she makes some personal life choices that, don't help her in her political career, such as it was. And, do I think she has the level of intellect of Abigail Adams? No, but very few people did. Yeah, there are a number of women who are involved on the political scene in Washington at this point. Is she the most effective of them? No, certainly not.
So now I've bashed them enough. I think we should I'm going to go a little positive here. If you had a chance to sit down with any of the Custis children, any single one you wanted, and got to have dinner with them and just ask them anything you've absolutely wanted to ask, you could only choose one, which one would it be?
Oh, definitely Eliza. I mean, Eliza is chafing against the boundaries set for her of womanhood and clearly wants more for herself and does sort of outrageous things like getting a sort of military type uniform made and riding on horseback through the city in it. And, writing letters where she's like, tell the Secretary of War, I said they should do this. She has an inflated sense of self-importance, but she also is just a fascinating person. And I would love to ask her about exactly what went down in her separation from her husband, because it's not, even at the time, everybody was sort of like, wait, why are they splitting up? Not getting along was not a reason to separate at that point. And from what I can tell, that's the main issue here, is that they just stopped getting along. And she really wanted her independence. And I think it would be fascinating to talk to her. She was also very melodramatic, which can be annoying in reading some of her letters. But out of the four siblings, I just think she's the most compelling.
Well, I want to spotlight somebody else, and you already mentioned him, William Costin. Can you tell me a little bit more about him? Because when we're talking about people taking their circumstances and getting the most out of it, he's absolutely fascinating. So can you tell me a little bit more about William Costin?
William Costin is not a very well-known figure. If he's been written about at all, it has been written about in the context of, is he actually Jackie Custis's son? And then there's been confusing stuff written about who his mother is. But basically, the theory here is that, so he is born in 1780. There's been debate over whether he was born enslaved, but I believe he was born enslaved, and I think probably on one of the Tidewater Custis estates, to a woman who went by both Anne and Nancy. What her background exactly was, she often gets identified as Anne Dandridge, and being a half sister Martha Washington, I don't think that is the case. But at any rate, William ends up, along with his mother and siblings, getting freed in 1802. And he actually marries, many listeners may have heard of Ona Judge from the book Never Caught. He marries Ona's sister, Delphi, and they have a family. He starts out as sort of a carriage driver, messenger in DC, and then he becomes a porter for the Bank of Washington and makes enough money that he buys several properties. He owns several houses. He uses his wealth for philanthropic efforts for the Black community in DC. And when there is a law passed that says that all Black people in DC, free Black people, need to register and sort of post a bond for good behavior, that they can lose the money and be kicked out of the city if they behave badly, he refuses to do it. And, it's sort of an act of civil disobedience. And then he takes it to court and challenges it. And in court, the argument that his lawyer makes, surely in consultation with him, if not at his behest, is, an actually civil rights kind of argument that you can't treat Black people differently. And the judge is like, oh, yeah, sure you can, but you can't apply this retroactively. So Costin wins on a technicality, but just the fact that he's making that larger argument, I think, is powerful. And he was so highly respected by both Black and white people in the city, probably much more so than the Custises in terms of actual respect and saying, this is somebody who's a, decent human being who has integrity. People talked about his integrity a lot. And, hordes of people came out for his funeral when he died.
Yeah, it's amazing how you can make a name for yourself when you're actually willing to work hard. Sorry, I had to get that one in. I had so many feelings. So one of the things with History Nerds United, we created this to kind of show that history is fun and interesting. It's not listen, I know they're wrong. They say history class is boring. Clearly not yours, but other ones, they will talk about that. We can't fix these people. But if I got one to sit in front of you and they said, why should I read First Family? What would you say?
I have often had people say that the Custuses seem like the Kardashians. They are famous for being famous. And this is a book, you might assume that a book about George Washington is going to be dry. It's going to be political history. But this is really a book about family and about people and complex people. And so anybody who has a family or is a person, which would be everybody, I would hope, should be able to relate to things in this book. And certainly the sort of Kardashian soap opera aspect is here. I've talked a little bit about that with Eliza, but I think with all of the siblings, they are outrageous in their own ways that we can look at now and find amusing. So I do hope that people who maybe are not regular readers of history or not regular readers of early American history will pick up this book and find it interesting.
Well, I loved it. Cassandra, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you.
Cassandra, thank you so much for coming on. Everybody go out and get First Family. You will not regret it. Hit us up, social media, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. Listen to other episodes of the podcast. Leave us comments, leave us reviews, ratings, 5 stars, please. And until next time, nerds, stay cool.